Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kristen Motti, a programs librarian at the Boston Public Library. Tonight's conversation with Lucy Adlington about the Dressmakers of Auschwitz, the true story of the women who sewed to survive, is presented in partnership with the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, our neighbors in Boston. Rachel King, Executive Director, will join us in just a moment to welcome you and to introduce Lucy. If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, please visit our partner bookseller for tonight's talk, Trident, on Newberry Street, which is also nearby the library and NEHGS. And you can use the code noted on the screen or in the chat to receive free media mail shipping anywhere in the US, or check your local library for copies in different formats. Now, just before we welcome Lucy, a couple of items in housekeeping. Many of you are probably familiar with the Zoom format, but in case if you're not, we're in Zoom webinar, so your cameras and microphones are muted. We do want to hear from you though, so tonight we're using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions and comments there, and the behind the scenes team will answer them or make sure that they're in the queue for our Q&A portion of the program, which will happen a little bit later in the hour. Thank you too to those of you who have already submitted questions in advance. Some relevant links will be shared out to you through the chat, so you'll see them there throughout the program. And we do have the live transcript closed captioning enabled if you'd like it. The button is also on the bottom of your screen, and you can toggle it on or off there. So thank you for joining us this evening. We've got an exciting hour ahead, and please join me in welcoming Rachel King. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And let me start by saying how pleased we are to partner with the Boston Public Library this evening. I'd also like to wish those of you in the audience celebrating the Jewish New Year a Shana Tova. And hello to everyone in the audience. As Kristen said, my name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director at the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society. The Jewish Heritage Center is a destination for exploring and preserving the history of Jewish families and institutions in Boston, New England, and beyond. We are an archive and an educational center located at New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. Among the more than 2 million documents in the Jewish Heritage Center's archives is an important collection with relevance for tonight's subject. And those are the records of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the Boston office of HIAS, which span from the 1880s to the 1970s and hold many case files of Jewish refugees seeking to leave Europe before and after World War II. Many documents in those case files tell the stories of people who survived the war and were able to make new lives in America. So much has been written about World War II and the Holocaust, and it can be astonishing to discover a book that provides a new lens and a fresh take on a subject we feel we know well. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Lucy Adlington, and her book, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, which introduces us to a group of indomitable women, their story of survival, and the fascinating surrounding context of clothing and textile history. Lucy Adlington is a British novelist and historian with more than 20 years specialization in social history. Her previous nonfiction titles include Stitches in Time, The Story of the Clothes We Wear, and Women's Lives and Clothing in World War II, Ready for Action. Her fiction titles include the award-winning young adult novel, The Red Ribbon. She runs the History Wardrobe series of costume presentations and has an extensive collection of vintage and antique clothing, some of which we will have the treat of seeing tonight. Lucy is joining us this evening from her home in Yorkshire, and this program has the special distinction of being the first online and transatlantic presentation on her book tour, as well as being the latest in the day. We are grateful that she is giving this talk at 11 p.m. to midnight, her time. So please join me in welcoming Lucy Adlington. Lucy.
Hello, hello. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you, Boston Public Library. Thank you, Rachel. It is such a privilege to have this invitation to speak with you all tonight. And it is a very special day in many ways. It's the US Book Publication Day for the Dressmakers of Auschwitz. So this is a very good time to thank my fabulous publishers and agent in the US who've done a wonderful job. The finished article here. But it's been quite a journey to get to this day, to get to this point. And how amazing is it that I can be in a farmhouse in Yorkshire in the north of England and speaking to you now. Some of you I know will be in Boston, but I know there are people from all over the world listening in. So hello and welcome, and thank you very much for joining me. And the story I'm going to talk about tonight is very much a story about connections. And yes, the connections that we're making in talking tonight, but also connections between the present day, between now, me writing a history book about the past, so connecting with the past like that, but connections with people also. I've had the opportunity to work in various archives, but also to speak with relatives of survivors, and perhaps most profoundly to go and visit the last surviving seamstress of the fashion salon in Auschwitz. And tonight there's a very special connection because we are joined this evening, assuming all the tech has gone well, by a relative and the niece of one of the dressmakers, Gila, who is in Boston. I had the great pleasure of visiting Boston in the early 1990s. It was flipping cold as well. It was January, and I just remember it being so cold, but so impressed by the city. And COVID put paid to my plans to visit Boston and visit Gila. This is the niece I'm talking about. Hello, Gila, if you're there. And I hope that next year we can make even more connections as we're able to travel more widely. And I'm also pleased to say hello to a very special friend of mine who is joining from New York today. So lots of connections, very personal ones, and also connections through history. But this story is also a story of contrasts, and some very stark contrasts between perhaps my comfortable life now in my farmhouse in Yorkshire, and to be researching and writing about the trauma that these young Jewish prisoners endured during the 1930s and 40s. Contrasts also in appearance. And I'm thinking now of contrasts between prisoners in Auschwitz and the SS guards with their magnificent uniforms. And I'm thinking most particularly of the contrast between the Jewish women who sewed in a fashion salon in Auschwitz and their clients, elite SS wives. So there is so much I could tell you about this story. And I keep saying the word story. It's all true. But I use the word story, and actually it was a story that brought me to writing this history book. Many years ago, I think it's nearly 18 years ago, I began researching links between the textile industry and the Holocaust, which may seem frivolous, but clothes, even fabulous clothes like this lovely 1940s gown I'm wearing, they always tell a story. And this might be a story of economics, because the textile industry for any country is worth a huge amount of money. It might be a story of art and culture, the design flair. It might be a story about the people who make the clothes and the fabrics and the designs, but also the people who wear them. So I was really interested, long been interested in the power of clothes, both as a form of theatre. If you picture the Nazi Nuremberg rallies with the immense rows of uniformed men, it's all very deliberate, this clothing. And thinking about clothing for dignity and clothing as a memento. So I was researching all of this, and I came across mention of a fashion salon in Auschwitz, which surely has to be one of the most grotesque anomalies ever. How was this possible? I attempted to find out more, and all I had really to track down was a list of nicknames, and they included Marta, Hunya, Eraina, Rene, Mimi, Lulu, Baba, Borishka. How could I find out more about these women with just nicknames? And women, of course, in records, they're much harder to find in some cases than men. They change their names, they're married, they're widowed, and sometimes also for Jewish women, converting and changing to a Hebrew form of the name. So I reached a dead end in some ways. And creatively, my brain was working, imagining what would it be like to be a young woman, a young female prisoner in Auschwitz, working in a fashion salon for the SS, for the very people who are dedicated to degrading you, to destroying you. And I wrote a novel. And I do appreciate that Holocaust fiction is not without its issues, but I wrote a novel imagining what it might be like for a group of young women. It was called The Red Ribbon, and it was published and had a very good audience worldwide, which is great. But serendipity. In writing a fictional story, I was able to make connections as I never could have done before, because news of this book reached people in Israel and Europe and the USA and Canada, and they got in touch. And I thank them for it, because the emails began to arrive. My aunt was a dressmaker in the fashion salon in Auschwitz. My mother was a dressmaker in the fashion salon in Auschwitz. My grandmother was head of the fashion salon in Auschwitz. And can you imagine how extraordinary it was for a historian to be jolted out of the theory of research and to be reminded with such impact that this isn't just history, it's people's lives. And one of the first images that I received from these very helpful, very supportive relatives of the seamstresses in the fashion salon in Auschwitz, one of the very first pictures, I hope you can see her here. This picture came through by email, and this shows Marta Fuchs, who was deported to Auschwitz in 1942. And she was on one of the first transports, or the first official Jewish transports from Slovakia to Auschwitz, transports of predominantly single Jewish women. So this picture of Marta arrived and more followed, the most extraordinary connections. And so through these wonderful contacts with the families, I was able to learn more about the real women, the real dressmakers of Auschwitz. And joining us tonight, as I've said, is the niece of one of the dressmakers. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit more to some of the faces here. You'll see photographs in the book, and then I'm going to turn to Gila's aunt last of all. And I'm going to focus on Gila's aunt tonight, her aunt Hunya, since Gila has that lovely Boston connection. So here is Marta. And I'll give you more background presently, but Marta was the capo, or the head, of the Upper Tailoring Studio, as it was called, a fashion salon established in Auschwitz by the camp commandant's wife, Hedwig Höss. And Marta was a very, very talented cutter, one of the most skilled parts of the dressmaking profession. I haven't time to go into it all now, but it's in the book. And Marta began to sew for Hedwig in Hedwig's villa, which is just on the other side of the wall, separating her private house, her lovely mansion, Hedwig's house, from the Auschwitz main camp. Marta was able to not only save her own life by sewing, save herself from hard labor and the gas chambers, she also used her wits, her cleverness, her compassion to save as many other lives as possible. So in the fashion salon established by Hedwig Höss, Marta created a haven, and she was able to salvage other lives from the hell of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the death rates were so staggeringly high. And among the women she saved are some of those pictured here, Here we've got a beautiful family portrait, Bracha and Katka Berkovich from Bratislava. Also from Bratislava, beautiful Irina Reichenberg here. They're featured in the book, you can see the pictures. And Bracha and Irina were very good friends, as was Renee here, Renee, a rabbi's daughter. And all of these young women were on these first transports into Auschwitz. And then I come to Hunya. Now, can you see, she's just behind me, looking incredibly stylish. This is a photograph of Hunya in 1934. So I'm going to give you some background about the dressmakers, about how this extraordinary salon came to be established in Auschwitz, this grotesque anomaly of beautiful fashions in the midst of hell. And I'm going to tell you about the dressmakers and the salon through the perspective of Hunya tonight. So Hunya was born in 1908 in Kežmarok, which is a small town in the high Tatras mountains of Slovakia. And the one thing Hunya wanted to do in life was to sew. It was a very traditional occupation for women in Europe, around the world at this time, considered very female to dressmake, along with teaching and nursing and so on. But Hunya was absolutely dedicated. She took her apprenticeship, she practiced at home, and eventually she decided Kežmarok was too small to hold her, and she took the train and traveled from Czechoslovakia into Germany, and she went to Leipzig and apparently loved the art and the culture of this big city. And the photograph taken here, she's looking very chic with neatly styled hair, a lovely top, lipstick and a ring, so very stylish. Like Marta, who would come to run this haven of a salon in Auschwitz, Hunya was a cutter, which meant that she could look at a dress, she could look at this gown, and she could figure out in her head how to turn it into a pattern. My grandmother, who was a dressmaker, was very similar. She was able to convert an image or a garment into a pattern just on newspaper, cut it out, have it cut out in fabric and made up into a garment. So eventually Hunya opened her own salon at home, like many dressmakers and tailors. She opened this in Leipzig, and she dressed so many elite women of Leipzig, Jews and non-Jews alike. But there are, of course, no happy endings in this story. In the 1930s in Germany, when this photograph was taken, Adolf Hitler had been in power for a year. And I want to show you now a garment from my collection that I hope will explain why I think clothes are so important, such an interesting way of looking at history. So if I dive into this suitcase, by the way, in the background here, this is my aunt's sewing machine used in the 1930s and 40s. Luckily, she was safe in England. So here is a very pleasant dress. I'm not sure if Zoom is picking up the color, but it's a very pretty apple green crepe dress. It's a floral frock. And you might think, well, it's just a dress. It's just a pretty frock. What does that have to do with Holocaust history? Well, first of all, I can tell you as a clothes specialist, clothing can tell you a lot about the culture and the economy of the country that it's made in. So if we have a closer look at this, by the way, the dress dates to about 1939, a very, very significant year, of course. So if we look at the hem, it's a very narrow hem, just rolled over, not a lot of fabric. The seams on the waistline, very, very narrow. There's very little fabric on any of the seams and just a little bit of fluting for decoration. So this already gives hints that the economy of this dress, it's in straitened circumstances. There isn't a lot of pizzazz, a lot of flair. And the dress is German. So Germany has been on a war footing economy-wise for many years by 1939, money being diverted into armaments, rearmaments for invasion. And what makes this dress even more sinister, in my view, is the label. And so often we don't have labels on clothing. We don't know who makes the clothes. And this label here is not from the shop, the boutique. It's not from the person who sewed it. If I can hold it up to you, perhaps you can read, there is an acronym, ADEFA, ADEFA. And in English, ADEFA stands for German Federation of German Aryan Clothing Manufacturers. ADEFA is one of the most sinister organizations of the textile industry in the 1930s. So while Hunya is running her salon in Leipzig, creating very stylish clothes, in Berlin, a group of men have come together to create ADEFA. Essentially, it's an organization designed to take over any Jewish businesses in the textile trade, in the textile and garment trade, and essentially to eliminate Jews from the trade. And I don't use that word lightly, because ADEFA is working alongside and with the full support of the Third Reich government. And as we know, as the 1930s progress, we are moving towards a literal elimination of Jewish people from Germany and ultimately from all lands under the Third Reich. So ADEFA tells German consumers, and by German, they mean Aryan, non-Jewish. They tell German consumers to buy only clothes that have not been touched by Jewish hands. The propaganda is all about buy from Germans, meaning Aryan. And we see this propaganda in such everyday, ordinary objects. I have here, it's another German artifact, and it's from Quelle, who are the biggest knitting yarn manufacturers in Germany. It's a book of just knitting yarn samples, some sensible colors, and some lovely ones. And inside, the text emphasizes that it is a German Christian company and everything is produced by Aryan hands only. So this knitting booklet, this pretty frock, they're absolutely saturated with anti-Semitism. And it's not only about excluding Jewish workers, Jewish talent and Jewish capital from the trade. It's also about appropriation. So increasingly, as Jews are stripped of their citizenship in Germany, they're also coming under pressure to hand over their businesses to Aryans. And this is something that Hunya has experience of in Leipzig. And many department stores and salons and haberdasheries are owned by Jewish people. And the Aryans, the Nazis, have decided they want them. So maybe for a nominal fee, they'll buy them, but it's all pressured. Or maybe they just take them over. And this is something that the families back in Slovakia, as it becomes, once the Germans have taken over Bohemia and Moravia, back in Slovakia, which is most certainly pro-fascist, the Jewish traders and Jewish business people are told, you can't operate a business. So Bracher and Katka Berkovich here, their father's a tailor. He's told, no, you can't sew. Irina Reichenberg, her father is a very talented shoemaker. No, you can't make shoes. And so even the young women themselves are told, you can't go to school, you can't study, you can't have a trade, which is not only terrifying and humiliating, because it's only because they're Jewish, it also raises that issue of how do you earn money. And so back in Bratislava, these young women, they decide that they're going to learn to sew anyway. And they learn to sew on the underground, the black market sewing lessons, if you will. And it's possibly one of the most fateful decisions of their lives. Now, Marta here already has a salon of her own in Bratislava. She's a little older than the others. But what of Hunya back in Leipzig? Well, she experiences firsthand all of the humiliations and the laws against Jewish people. She speaks of having to go out with her handbag crossed over the Jewish star, which all Jewish people are forced to wear. And yet her spirit is not crushed. And one reason that we know so much about Hunya's life in the 1930s and 40s is thanks to her own testimony and thanks to the stories that she told her niece Gila. As Hunya sat and sewed, Gila sat and wrote these stories, quite extraordinary. So Hunya experiences the boycotts against Jewish businesses, the violence of Kristallnacht, where Jewish synagogues and people and businesses are targeted. And eventually she experiences something that the Nazis have been moving towards, forced labor. Hunya is forced into a fur factory. Leipzig is famous for its fur, and she's forced to make furs for the Wehrmacht. And although she does receive a nominal amount of money, it's not unusual for the Germans who say, we don't want our clothes to have been touched, created by Jewish hands like this dress. But then with blatant hypocrisy, they corral people into ghettos, into forced labor camps. And there they set up factories, exploiting Jewish labor, sometimes with a nominal amount of wage, and sometimes just for the right to live. And so there are many industrial factories. There are thousands across German-occupied countries and in the Reich itself. And in the ghettos such as Łódź and Warsaw and Krakow, all of these places have industrial sewing, making uniforms, transforming furs. So the idea of using Jewish people as slave labor is nothing new, but a fashion salon? Well, to know how this comes about, we have to travel with these young women to Auschwitz. And the young women of Slovakia are deported in March and April 1942. Essentially, the pro-fascist government pays the Germans, here, have 500 Reichsmarks for every single Jewish woman. And you can read in the book the experience of how it was for these young women to be forced into holding camps and then onto the trains, and then crossing the border into Poland and arriving at Auschwitz. There had been stories, but they'd been told they were going to work. Why should they expect anything else? As for Hunya in Leipzig, she was deported, she wasn't deported until July 1943, so a little later than the rest. And she'd already heard rumors, she already had a sense of where she was going. But even on the journey, Hunya tried to keep her spirits up and those around her. But she said when they arrived at Auschwitz from Leipzig, and by the way, I did read an account that spoke of this transport because Hunya was on the last transport of Jews from Auschwitz. And this scholarly account said there are no known survivors of this transport. And I thought, yes, there are. So Hunya was on this transport with a friend of hers called Ruth and Ruth's husband. And as the doors were pulled open at Auschwitz, and this is before the infamous siding into Birkenau, Hunya said, we had the customary reception, screamings and beatings. But just before the men were separated from the women, Ruth, Hunya's friend, Ruth's husband said, stick with Hunya. I have a feeling she'll make it. Now, unfortunately, Hunya and Ruth were separated in the chaos of Birkenau, and Hunya had to undergo the same transformation that had awaited all of these women arriving at the camp. Now, when the first Jewish women arrived, they were, and I won't describe the process, but they were stripped of their own clothes, their own dignity, their own sense of humanity, humiliated, degraded, and violated. And they were flung dirty, bullet-ridden Russian POW uniforms from men who'd been murdered previously. By the time Hunya arrived, there'd been sewing workshops set up to create the infamous striped uniforms. So Hunya, even when she arrived, knew the value of clothes, and she attempted to keep her sturdy work shoes with her. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to do so. And one of the reasonings behind this stripping of people when they arrived at Auschwitz, it was purely to degrade. That sense of you can render people subhuman in the eyes of their captors if you take away their clothes. There's things that are so intimate to them. Didn't need to take the clothes. The Nazis did not need to give out the uniforms. It was done as deliberate psychology to contrast between the SS guards with their magnificent uniforms and these prisoners who were to be treated as vermin and as disposable. So the hell of hard labor is what faced these dressmakers. And I do describe a great deal of what they had to endure. I think of Irina Reichenberg in particular, having to help build the gas chambers with her bare hands, and they were working in quarries. And all of the women recognized that to survive, they had to get better work than the hard labor. And so working indoors was preferable. And many of the young women were put to working in the giant plunder warehouses of Auschwitz called Canada. And here they had to sort through the clothing of deportees that had arrived with all their suitcases and luggage. And this wasn't just a whim, a logistical whim of the Nazis. The clothing was all part of the economic enterprise run by the SS. Auschwitz was not only an extermination center, it was a profit-making enterprise. And it's hideous to think of it that way. But the whole zone of interest, miles and miles of agricultural sites, of factories, of workshops, of construction sites, they were to make money for the SS, money from slave labor. And so in Canada, these young women sorted through the clothes of new arrivals, sometimes finding the clothes of their own murdered relatives. And that's when you realize that clothes do have those connections. I can barely imagine finding clothes that you recognize as belonging to your mother or your child or your spouse. And it wasn't, like I say, this just wasn't just a whim. This was very deliberate to keep all of the belongings, not just the valuables, the clothing too. They were sorted into bundles and sent back to Germany. And here they were distributed. So within Auschwitz, profit-making enterprises, we have weaving sheds, sewing sheds, tailors' workshops, cobblers, leather workshops. And who is taking advantage of these? The SS. So Hedwig Höss, in her fine villa by Auschwitz main camp, had regular contacts with all of the workshops, and anything she wanted for her stolen house, she could have it. Stolen artwork, stolen furniture, stolen furnishings, stolen clothes. She was happy to wear the underwear of prisoners, of deportees rather, who'd come to the camp. But that wasn't enough for her. She wanted women to sew for her. And not content with having to pay wages for local Polish seamstresses, Hedwig Höss co-opted Marta Fuchs. And it must have been so challenging for Marta to go along to the Höss villa and see all the food and the luxury that the SS family were living in. And Marta actually went out in the garden with the children and they said, "You can sit on the swing. We'll watch you to make sure you don't escape." And yet knowing what conditions were like for her friends, her loved ones back in Auschwitz and in Birkenau. But as I say, Marta was canny, as we say up in the north of England. And when Hedwig wanted more clothes, Marta said, "I need more help sewing." And eventually Marta's clothes were so admired that the other SS wives from personnel at the camp, they got jealous of Hedwig's wardrobe. They too wanted their own pet seamstresses. And so Hedwig established a fashion salon in the SS admin block, just along about 10-minute walk from her house. It's part of Auschwitz. You can still see the building now. And it was called the Stabsgebäude. And here in the basement, there were laundry rooms and mending rooms for the SS, all run by enslaved prisoners. And in one floor of the basement was the Upper Tailoring Studio, this fashion salon. And it was headed by Marta, who was one of the kindest and bravest capos that I've read about in the camp. And here in this haven, Marta collected relatives and friends, as many women as she could save. She also used the fashion salon as a hub for resistance, and more about that in the book. And Hunya arrived here after a horrendous time in Birkenau. dreadfully ill, and she arrived there by chance and connections. Some friends from Keshmarok saw her passport on a pile of discarded papers, and they said, Hunya's here, we must try and help her. And through these connections, they got word to Marta, and Marta sent for Hunya to work in the salon. But you to imagine what it must have been like for these young women having to sew for the SS. And the clients would come in, Hedwig Höss and the other SS wives. And we know from testimonies that the women would look through magazines. So I have a few examples of original magazines to show you. Die Mode here. This was very much a National Socialist linked fashion magazine. And also this one is Die Dame, one of the longest running fashion magazines in Germany. Both of them folded in 1943 due to lack of paper. So that tells you a lot about the German war economy. So the women would look through these designs, and the cutters, who were Marta and a woman named Boryska Zobel, about whom I've been able to find relatively little yet, and also Hunya, they were tasked with making up the designs that the SS women had chosen. All of the fabrics came from the plunder warehouses. The sewing machines stolen from Jewish businesses and Jewish tailors and dressmakers. Everything stolen by the SS. Don't worry. The dressmakers did their fair share of pilfering, and they in turn stole what they could to help other more needy prisoners. An extraordinary bit of sabotage, which could have cost them their lives. And one final bit of dressmaking background, and I could talk about this for a very long time. Here is a National Socialist women's magazine, the Frauenwarte, and as well as the fashions inside, get a sense of that. We also have the paper patterns. And anybody who thinks that dressmaking must be easy, just imagine trying to decipher something like this. There are roughly 25 different garments, each with a multitude of pieces, all overlaid on one sheet of paper. So the skill of these women was phenomenal. Although Marta did also save some women who were frankly unable to sew, but she hid them in the salon. And to give you an idea of some 40s fashions, I'll just bring this over. So a beautiful gown from my collection, a lovely chartreuse crepe. And Hunya said in the salon, they made clothes for the SS women that they could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. So pure privilege, pure indulgence at the expense of Jewish dressmakers. Did they ever make the connection? Well, read the book and see what you make of these SS clients, because I wrote this book in a fury at them, in such anger. So beautiful gowns. And Hunya herself was able to have various privileges in the Stabsgebäude. She was able to wash. She had more respectable clothes. But most importantly, the sense of connection was the loyalty of all the women in the Upper Tailoring salon, in this fashion studio. And Hunya said they were united in joy and sorrow. They were like a family. So there's so much more I could tell you, but I can see that time is ticking out. So when you read the book, you'll discover what happened, the fates of all of these dressmakers. There were roughly 25 women that I've been able to track down. There is always more to know. And as archives open up, I intend to find out more about the rest of the women. Such extraordinary stories. And the story doesn't end with the liberation of Auschwitz in January 45, because most of the dressmakers were on one of the horrific death marches out of the camp. There were escape attempts. Some were shot, some survived. For some of the women, there were reunions in the post-war, their post-war homelands, and for others, desolation. But one of the first things they did after the war was to hunt out a sewing machine and start sewing again. But this time not for the SS, this time to earn a living, but also to sew out of love for their friends, for their family, for themselves, to reclothe themselves. And I'm going to show you the most extraordinary garment in my collection before I finish. So here we have, so I almost don't like touching this dress, this Adefa dress. I'll put that away. Here we have a silk suit made after the war. And this was made by Wyner. Wyner was able to emigrate to what was then Palestine. The British Mandate of Palestine became Israel, and lived in Tel Aviv. And it was a real privilege for me to go and visit the site of Wyner's house in Tel Aviv. And while I was there, to visit other relatives of the various dressmakers who were so welcoming and so kind. And this was sent to me by Gila, and I can't tell you how it felt to examine this garment. It has no label. You wouldn't know who'd made it or where or what their story was. But for me, knowing Wyner's story, and it was thanks to Gila that I knew so much about Wyner as well, because Gila wrote beautiful, beautiful testimony, an account of Wyner's experiences. In addition, Wyner wrote her own testimony, which is lodged in San Francisco, and also completed various other questionnaires. I mean, that's a whole topic of archives and uncovering the stories of these dressmakers in archives and so on. But to look at this and to look at the stitching, how often do you think about your clothes, about who made them? So Wyner sewed post-war for some very illustrious fashion houses in Israel. And then she learnt more industrial sewing, factory sewing, for a leisure wear company called Gottlieb. And every time I look at this, I just think of her hands stitching this with love for her niece, that these are hands that have had to dress the SS. Now, sadly, I never had the chance to meet Wyner, although there's so much about her I feel I know through Gila's account and through her testimony. And I was able to meet someone who knew Wyner well, the last surviving seamstress of Auschwitz. I'm not going to tell you who that was. You can read the book. I visited her. I had the great good fortune to meet her in San Francisco in 2019. And when I said, do you remember, I have so many questions. I said, do you remember Wyner? And she said, I liked Wyner. I think you will too when you read the book. And I think you will appreciate all the stories of these remarkable women. They each deserve a book of their own. And I'm going to finish now because of the constraints of time. And it is such a fascinating topic, so many implications. And I'm going to finish, and I'm actually reminded of Wyner in Tel Aviv, when her young relatives, Gila, amongst others, used to go and visit. Wyner would talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And then after several hours, Gila would make moves to leave, and Wyner would apparently say, are you going already? So that's how it feels like for me. I have so much appreciated having the chance to share some of my research, some of the stories of these women. And whether you borrow or buy or listen to the book, there is an audio book. All of the dressmakers have suspiciously Yorkshire accents because I narrated the book. But however you encounter this book, and I do hope you will read more, I hope that what you take away is a profound sense of appreciation for the resilience of these women, for their incredible sense of connections and loyalty within the fashion salon in Auschwitz. And I'm so proud that I've had the opportunity to write this book, and in this way to be able to honor their memories, because all of the survivors who gave testimonies, they all said it is so important to keep speaking of these things, to keep connected. So I'm going to stop. I don't even know how I want to speak for weeks more. And I am really pleased to answer any questions you may have, and you can either ask them in the chat function, or you can also contact me. My contact form is going to be up in the chat function too. And I'm just going to sit here with Wyner's beautiful sewing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That was fascinating and just such a delight to hear, and congratulations on the publication of your book today. We do have a number of questions from the audience, both submitted beforehand and also while you were talking. One of the questions that came up several times while you were speaking, and David and Annette both asked this, is they're curious if you could speak more about the role of men, and were there men in tailoring studios similarly to the women who were able to do this work and save themselves through their horrific experiences.
Well, thank you for asking about that. My speciality has long been women's history, because it's so often overlooked. Women's narratives are overlooked in traditional histories, and a lot of the public monuments and honors, and this is setting aside from Holocaust history and survivor testimonies, it has focused on the deeds of great men, essentially. And I've long been interested in the stories of ordinary people. And so I'm less interested in couture, for example, than in dressmakers who could be our relatives. So when I started researching the links between the Holocaust textile trade and the Holocaust and the textile trade, yes, I was looking at tailors. And of course, there is a phenomenal tradition of great skills in Jewish tailoring. My nearest city, Leeds, has a thriving industry, has long had a thriving industry. So yes, there are many stories, many accounts of specialist tailors, as well as the factory tailors and so on. But it was when I discovered the evidence of the fashion salon in Auschwitz, I knew I had to specialize. There was so much I wanted to say. And, you know, maybe another book. I'm so interested in the ways that the tailors, as well as the dressmakers, were able to be part of the underground, to be part of the resistance. And in other death camps, there were tailors and cobblers and shoemakers who were part of uprisings, you know, so they used their position of intimacy with the SS, you know, measuring them for coats and boots and so on. They used them to their advantage, rather like Marta in the fashion salon. But this is a big book already, so I really had to specialize. But I'm always collecting more stories. One of Hedwig Höss's links in Auschwitz was a chap called Grunke, who was part of the leatherworks in Auschwitz, who also linked in with tailors. So it's a question really of continuing to research. But I suppose we might expect to hear stories of tailors making SS uniforms. And there are details in the book about Rudolf Höss and the women who made his shirts and so on. But it's just the absolute contrast between the glamorous image of the SS women in their fashions and the laboring enslaved workers that caught my attention in this case.
Thank you for that. Rachel?
Yes, we had one question submitted in advance, Lucy, that is caught my eye as the director of an archive. And that was, if you could tell us a little bit about the repositories and the archives that you did your research in, and did you end up in any surprising places as you were doing your research? And for people who have yet to read the book, you will have this treat of hearing these women's stories, but also reading this really exhaustive research that Lucy has done about, you know, clothing and textile history, but also about the camps and everything going on around. So Lucy, can you tell us a little bit about your research and the repositories that you consulted?
Yes, thank you for that question. I have long been interested in Holocaust history, although I came to it through literature. As an undergraduate at Cambridge and studying what they call the literature of atrocity. And as a postgrad, I gradually converted to the idea of combining history and archaeology, essentially materiality, material culture, how all these things combine. So all of that fed in over the last 20 years into this research. But it was when I had names from the relatives of survivors that I was able to do a lot more online searching. I mean, Yad Vashem, of course, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum have phenomenal resources, and also the Wyner Holocaust Library in London. But the real, I would say treasure trove, is that appropriate? It was in San Francisco, and it is the archives deposited at the Tauber Holocaust Library by Dr. Laurie Shelley. Laura Shelley, as Laura Weinberg, was deported from Germany to Auschwitz, and she worked in the Stabsgebäude along with many other Jewish inmates in a secretarial role. So she knew the dressmakers. And in the 1980s, she began collecting testimonies, thinking, rightly thinking, you know, these will be lost if we don't collect them. And it's thanks to her that we know what we know, because she asked the women whose stories had perhaps not been collected, they'd perhaps been overlooked. And amongst them was Hunya's testimony. And I just had the most extraordinary time in San Francisco. You have to be a researcher to appreciate it, perhaps, but diving into boxes and not knowing what you're going to find. And it took me many hours to find evidence of the dressmakers, but once I had, there were files with correspondence and images, and it's so tactile being in an archive, and also incredibly moving. I forgot to eat or drink for hours on end, because here were the handwriting of the dressmakers, here were their aerograms. Do you remember aerograms? And letters from France, letters from Israel, letters from Greece. So that really, it really was thanks to Dr. Laurie Shelley that we know so much about the context of these women's lives. And research is ongoing as archives have been closed due to COVID. And I know there are still testimonies that I need to listen to.
Thank you.
Dina asks why it's taken so long for this history to come out, decades after the end of the war.
There are so many stories, aren't there? And I think some of it, I mean, as we know, just shortly after the war, very few people wanted to listen. And it wasn't until the growing swell of survivor testimonies of the 1980s, you know, this is even after the very public trials, it took a swell of interest from the public. And also, I suppose, for survivors, having the strength to be able to share your testimonies. It sometimes takes 40, 50 years, speaking to the second or third generations. So I think there is that, but I also think some of it is because it's about women sewing. And I found in my career as a clothes historian that so often people say, oh, it's just clothes, without appreciating all of the history behind it. And I think in a way as well, the women themselves, many of the survivors were very typically very modest and so eager to memorialize their own family who'd been murdered rather than to speak of their own experiences. And so, yes, it's taken a long time to glean this information. And I suppose in a way it took someone like me to look at this link between fashion and the Holocaust and to look at it with fresh eyes. But there are always more stories. We know that people are still publishing their memoirs, that there's a ever-growing body of scholarly work. So I think there's always more to know, and I think people are now ready to listen.
Thank you.
Lucy, first of all, I should say we've had several comments about how fabulous your dress is. And that's a happy comment. There is a question, Barbara actually asks, have any of the fashions sewn by these women for the German wives been found? Does anything still exist? Have you found any of these?
So much was destroyed in December and January 1944 and 1945. The SS deliberately trying to destroy records or move them away from the Russians further into Germany. We know that there was an order book, a big black book, Hunya had called it, of orders from Berlin. The highest names in Berlin, said Hunya, but Marta never said whose names were in there. That was destroyed. And when I contacted the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, they said, no, we have no records of the Upper Tailoring Studio. And among the clothing that they have at Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, it's clothing from Canada warehouses. When Hedwig fled Auschwitz, she took with her freight cars full of plunder. But I was in correspondence with her grandson, Wyner, and to his knowledge, she kept no garments. I mean, why would she? That, you know, that she would evolve her fashions, and she perhaps didn't, she felt no emotional connection to these clothes. She probably felt no emotional connection to the women she forced to make them. So to my knowledge, no, but we don't know, because clothing like this, it doesn't have a label. It has a story, but it can't tell us. So who knows the clothing that I buy clothing from Germany, from Poland. We don't know who wore these clothes. We don't know who made them. The fashion magazines I have, they're from Krakow. Who took them to Krakow in 1943? We don't know. So that's a very eerie thing about the clothing, is that for all we know, yes, there could be, and we would never be able to tell.
Thank you.
If we shift gears just a little bit to questions about your writing process, you've addressed your research process a little bit. We have had a couple of questions, both with registration and during your conversation, about how long it took to write the book. What was the process? Is there anything that you haven't mentioned that you want the writers in the audience to know about the process?
Wow. Well, it took 20 years and 1 year, if you know what I mean. So much of my work, my research, my experience converged. And in a way, the pandemic forced my hand, as well as having a deadline for the publishers. There were many publishers worldwide waiting for this book, which was surprising yet gratifying to me. And I wrote it during multiple lockdowns, because it meant that I couldn't go and do even more research. And it was really hard, actually. I had to, there was so much material, as any writer will know, to gather the material. But what drove me was very much that sense of, I must tell these stories. These stories have to be told. And that process of writing during the pandemic was also very moving. I was in touch with Mrs. Kohut, the last surviving seamstress, via Skype. We couldn't meet in person. And I was struck so much while collating all of the testimonies and all of the background information about that sense of resilience of the women. And it was so harrowing to write, of course, but as I wrote, I kept thinking of Bracha. This is Bracha saying, we are going to get out of here. We are going to have coffee and cake in Bratislava again. And there was Hunya saying, we are not going out up the chimneys. We are going to get out of here alive. And it gave me such a sense of appreciation for the relative safety, despite the pandemic, for relative comforts, and for that lovely humane connection of emails and Skype and so on. So it was an unusual writing process. And yes, writing a book is always so hard. And yet when you finish it, you send it out thinking, is anybody going to like this? And I am so pleased that it has found its readers.
Thank you so much for that.
Well, we are just about at time, but why don't we do one more question? Michelle asks, she says, I can imagine that the research for this book could be very emotional. How did you deal with that, and what made you smile during your research?
You have to smile, don't you, at times. Hunya made me smile. Bracha made me smile. The resilience of these women. But it wasn't really about smiling. I think it's also okay to be upset. I mean, we should be upset. This is a harrowing read. I have not filtered it. I wanted it to be as true as someone who's decades after the event, who's not experienced it. I wanted it to be as true as possible. So it was right that, yes, you have nightmares, and yes, it's extremely distressing, but it has to be done. It's just so important. And I wrote it, I said I wrote it with lots of rage. I also wrote it with lots of compassion, because even though these women will never know how we may feel about them and how we may honor them, I think it's still so important to feel at that sense of connection, whether it's across time or across continents. So yeah, it was really hard, and I won't say it's an easy read, but I think it's really important.
Thank you. It's a beautiful book, and you do come to know these women so well, and to really care about them. Would you leave us with a little taste of the book and a reading?
I had the extraordinary experience of narrating the book, and it really does hit home, actually. Sometimes when you read it, you know this book so well, and you gloss over it, and you occasionally miss typos. But hearing it said, it really, every single line of it hit home, the things that these women endured. And I'm going to leave you with an anecdote from a letter that Hunya wrote to Dr. Laurie Laura Shelley, that's in the archives in San Francisco. And it's one of the first anecdotes that I knew. And it also combines something of the idea of being a dressmaker for the SS. So just to give you a little context, it is set in the Upper Tailoring Studio, as the fashion salon was called, in the Stabsgebäude, which is the SS admin block. And I was able to discover a lot more information about the guard who worked there. Her name was SS Elizabeth Rupert. So let's finish with Hunya, shall we? Hunya has I'll fill you in again. Hunya has arrived at the sewing workshop, has been inducted. She's met Marta. She's met her friends from Slovakia. After the initial euphoria of feeling safe in the Stabsgebäude, Hunya recognized that the younger women in particular were feeling the strain of carrying out so much work under this much pressure. The job was something they were trained for, yet the tension of sewing for SS guards and SS wives was ever present. They could never forget they were dressing the enemy. The interaction between dressmaker and client is peculiarly intimate. The seamstress takes a tape measure to a semi-naked body. She's aware of all the physical defects. She perhaps senses her client's insecurities and has to pander to their vanity. A dress fitting would ordinarily be quite a chatty, friendly affair, as client and seamstress discuss the garment. For the Auschwitz dressmakers, these conversations were fraught with layers of tension. The SS had gone to great lengths to distance themselves physically and symbolically from subhumans, as the inmates were called. Yet here were Jewish prisoners laying hands on elite Nazi women, pinning hems, checking darts and smoothing seams. At any moment, the client might resent familiarity from an inmate, resulting in punishment or dismissal from the coveted job. The interactions also meant that the SS were forced to concede that the inmates were human beings, something that went contrary to all training and indoctrination. One such precarious interchange took place as Elizabeth Rupert, the suited, booted SS guard, strode between the rows of women working. Hunya was bent over her needle and thimble in apparent submission, but she had come a long way from the days of being stripped, beaten, and humiliated in Birkenau. Rupert stopped to admire Hunya's sewing skills, declaring, "When the war's over, I'm going to open a large dressmaking studio with you in Berlin. I never knew that Jewesses could work, let alone so beautifully." "Not on your life," muttered Hunya, speaking Hungarian. "What did you say?" snapped the SS woman. "How nice that will be," came the more dutiful reply in German. When the war's over, it was easy for a guard to daydream about a fantasy fashion shop staffed by obedient Jews. For the inmates, there was the very strong possibility they would not live to see the end of the war. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And thank you for that powerful excerpt, which I know will whet our audience's appetite for reading the book. Thank you again. I am pleased, before we leave, we will share a little bit about what's happening at the Jewish Heritage Center and at the Boston Public Library. I'm pleased to let you know about a couple of programs coming up with the Jewish Heritage Center this fall. On Tuesday, October 26th, we welcome historian Dr. Melissa Clapper, who conducted a research fellowship at the Jewish Heritage Center this past summer. She will be giving the annual Genevieve Geller Wyner lecture on her research topic, At Home in the World, American Jewish Women Abroad. And please save the date for an online course the Jewish Heritage Center is offering 4 Tuesdays in November, which focuses on Jewish immigration to America between the 1840s and 1924. Registration is not open yet, but check back on our website soon. I hope you'll join us again, and I invite you to learn more about the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website at jewishheritagecenter.org. Thank you so much for joining us. Kristen?
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much, Lucy Adlington, for sharing your work, and congratulations again on the publication of your book today. From the Boston Public Library, we would like to thank our partners at the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center and EHGS, and our bookselling partner, Trident Booksellers and Cafe. If you would like to get a copy of the book, you can see the information here on the screen, and it will be shared again in the chat. There's free shipping, and you can use the code that's shared there in the chat to get your copy of the Dressmakers of Auschwitz. To find out more about programs, services, and resources at the Boston Public Library for people of all ages, both virtually and in person, please visit us at bpl.org. And a few upcoming talks that we have at the BPL are next Thursday. We are working again with the New England Historic Genealogical Society to host Nathaniel Philbrick in his new book, Travels with George. On Wednesday, September 29th, we have a business-focused talk with Dr. Stephanie Pinder-Amaker and Dr. Lauren Wadsworth. That talk will be virtual only. And on Saturday, October 2nd at 3 p.m., musician, singer, and now author M. Greiner will join us both in person and virtually with her new book, The Healing Power of Singing. Raise your voice and change your life. So on that note, thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We hope to see you again, either here virtually or in person. Take care and be well. Good night.